Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see these slides, and this is what we'll be going through today. And then you can adjust your personal view however you want to see it. I think you can do speaker view, which is whoever is speaking is whose kind of individual camera you see, or you can do gallery view or something like that where you can see the whole crew. So whatever you're most comfortable with as far as your view is fine with us. So we'll go ahead and get started. David, you want to cover the outline here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is obviously just the outline, what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go over the background of, what carbon neutrality actually is, how do we quantify it, in upper education at least. Then we'll talk about, the succeeding universities that are doing really well with carbon neutrality and progressing towards that goal. Then we're going to talk about the most employed and most successful strategies that those universities are taking right now. Then we're going to take a look at the newest university to announce that they are carbon neutral, Colorado College. And then we'll wrap it up by talking about some of the challenges of reaching carbon neutrality as a university and what all that entails from administratively and in more depth. Jessica will take that. And then at the end, we'll have, like Jessica said, times for questions and discussions where you guys can either put in the chat box your questions or unmute yourself. And we'll just address that when they come.
All right, so we'll get started with the first section.
All right, so I'm pretty much just going to read from the slide here. It's very simple. Definition of carbon neutrality. This one is from the Department of Energy and Climate Change for the United Kingdom. And it's through the transparent process of calculating, reducing, and then offsetting the emissions that you have to where net carbon emissions equals zero. That's obviously carbon neutrality. And so on the right there, I just put the steps, and you're going to be seeing this throughout a couple different slides later. We're reinforcing this. First, you got to calculate, then you try to avoid as much as you can, reduce those emissions through efficiency measures and other strategies, and then finally offset what you can't really reduce or avoid to get there. Next slide. So when we're talking about establishing what your carbon footprint is and how much emissions you have, it's the measure of the total greenhouse gas emissions due to both your direct and indirect activities. And Jessica will go through this a little bit later again, scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure some of you are very familiar, and some of you may not be very familiar with those terms. But all these emissions are included: methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, PFCs, CFCs. And what you do is you take those emissions and we convert it into the carbon dioxide equivalent using the International Panel on Climate Change's global warming potential of each gas to get that carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is just the this is the IPCC's GWP for each gas. I believe assessment report number 6 is due out in 2022, I think. And so we're going to be getting some updated numbers on here, but right now you can tell obviously carbon dioxide is the base for global warming potential at 1, and then all those other gases very quickly elevate as you go down the list here, and these are deemed the most important gases that we need to curb. So that's really the goal of what carbon neutrality is establishing which gases are the worst and how do we avoid and reduce those so that we reduce our carbon footprint rather.
Yeah, next slide, as David said, we're measuring these, but we're only going to report it in the terms of carbon dioxide equivalent.
Right.
Basically, we'll take this number, convert it all to one single unit for consistency in reporting. But just because we're just saying carbon dioxide doesn't mean that we're not also including these other greenhouse gas emissions in that calculation. It's just all rolled into one figure.
So going a little bit further into the scope 1, 2, and 3, and then, yeah, Jessica, obviously hop in whenever you want to, but scope 1, direct emissions from the owned or controlled sources that you have. So a lot of universities have on-site generation, whether that be gas or renewables, et cetera. In addition to those owned vehicles as well, that counts as scope 1. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from your purchased electricity, obviously, and your electricity, steam, water, all those count towards your scope 2 emissions. And then scope 3 is everything else that you can't really quantify into scope 1 or scope 2. And the big thing here, especially for universities and that send people to a lot of different conferences, is air travel, procurement, and then waste are the biggest ones. The next slide, this is a great illustration of scope 1, 2, and 3. I think the first time I saw this, I was actually 2 years ago in Jessica's intro to sustainability class. So she was the first one that put me onto this graph right here. So you guys can take some time. Again, this will be posted on YouTube, I believe, and in other places. So, and I'm sure some of you have already seen this, but it's a great resource to go back to if you're not sure about which emissions land in which scope. This is a good place to start.
And one thing that's interesting about higher education is the difference between scope 1 and scope 2 can vary by campus based on what sort of resources you have available to you. So an example of this is a lot of older universities, like 100 years old plus universities, have power plants on campus that are owned and operated by the university. And that's because the university was built at a time before the grid was mature enough to reach out to them. So you might think of Purdue, for example, and IU, they both have power plants on campus because they were in more rural settings. The grid wasn't quite mature enough to get out to them. So in order for them to receive their energy, they had to self-supply, basically. They had to build their own local grid. So that would show up in scope 1 for universities that have their own power plant versus a university like IUPUI. We're fairly young, 50 years old. We do not have a power plant on campus. We don't do much on campus generation besides some solar. So the majority of our utility is scope 2, as in we purchase all of our utilities. So our electricity, natural gas, water, steam, all of that is purchased directly from a utility. We don't manage it ourselves. So it's a difference in accounting as far as how we keep track of those emissions, but whether it's scope 1 or scope 2. So
that goes pretty well into that one.
Yeah, for IUPUI specifically, this is just an example of the things that are included in our different scopes. And again, this is for us, right? It might be different for a different university based on how it's set up. And these are the biggest categories that we look at. One thing that's interesting about natural gas is that though the natural gas is delivered to campus via a utility, in this case citizens, the actual combustion of that natural gas does not happen until it's on campus. So for example, students in a laboratory, maybe they have a Bunsen burner and you're actually going to light that natural gas at the level of the Bunsen burner. Therefore, it's considered scope 1 because it's actually burned on site, even though it is delivered via a utility. So just kind of some nuance in language there. We also have to take into account transmission losses for utilities, whether they are on campus or off campus. So whenever we're using energy, you have to create more than you actually need to use, because in the process of it being sent to campus or around campus, you're going to see losses in that energy. So we have to account for that loss as well, because you were still burning that same amount of coal or natural gas or whatever your original source of energy was, and you still have to account for that. And then in the scope 3, these are the big categories for IUPUI that we try to look at as well.
This is, again, I told you guys I would hammer it in a couple different slides. So measure, set your target reductions, manage to reduce direct emissions, and then offset what you can't need. That's the picture on the left and the picture on the right. I really like, but again, it's the same exact process that we keep talking about: calculate, avoid, reduce, offset, and that's the way you do it to become carbon neutral.
You're going to hear us say a lot of this today. These steps. Right, but what happens within those big steps is where it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to talk about, some schools doing really well, and why they might be doing well. And we're going to be looking at this data through the scope of Second Nature Commitment, formerly, the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. That's what it used to be called. Now it's pretty much just called Second Nature. And there's two types. Well, technically there's three types of different commitments. The climate commitment down at the bottom includes both the carbon and resilience. So when someone or when a president signs for a climate commitment, they are just including those top two, the carbon and resilience. But it's very straightforward. Carbon commitment is exclusively on reducing the emissions to zero and mitigating their contribution to climate change from the campus level. They have to set a date for second nature of when their target goal for carbon neutrality will be. The second type of commitment is the resilience one. And Jessica put it really well earlier. We had a staff meeting today, and she's talking about how the resilience commitment is, preparing your infrastructure, your campus infrastructure to, withstand or uphold the value that it's supposed to have in the face of these oncoming changes for climate change down the road. And that's building community capacity to deal with constantly changing climate and resulting extremes. So again, it's just very focused on the infrastructure, whereas the carbon is pretty much solely focused on reducing the emissions. And that is, so those are the public commitments that we talked to. In the process of gathering a lot of data from the first project that I briefly mentioned at the start of the webinar, I found a lot of universities have internal commitments that they aren't able or allowed, or for whatever reason have not made public yet. And I think Jessica is going to touch on those a little bit later. But the public commitment through Second Nature is very strong, because Second Nature has a platform, an online platform, where you can see everyone's progress. They have progress reports. They have, their greenhouse gas emission reports. They have all this data that's publicly available. So again, Jessica said it earlier in our meeting, it's one thing to follow a script when it's private, but it's a whole nother thing to, make a public commitment and then not live up to it. So there's definitely a lot more pressure when you make that public commitment. We've seen, obviously, some schools doing really well through the Second Nature commitment. Next slide.
Just in general, university, we tend to play different when we know somebody else is keeping score versus if somebody's just keeping score internally versus an external entity. But there are different reasons why a campus, completely valid reasons why a campus might choose to do one over the other. And we're talking more about the details of those. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this next slide, this one's mine. Just so you're aware, this first step of greenhouse gas accounting or tracking your emissions. In higher education, we use a tool that's called SIMAP, Sustainability Indicator Management and Analysis Platform. It's basically a tool that was developed by higher ed for higher ed. So the University of New Hampshire developed SIMAP. It used to be called the Campus Carbon Calculator, and then it was kind of rebranded here in the past few years. So it's developed by higher ed, specifically for higher ed, for the types of things that we need to track that other sectors may not. There are tools similar to this across sectors. So CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, that a lot of for-profit entities might use, ICLEI, which municipalities might use, the EPA tool, which is free to anyone. But this one is specifically for higher education. And not only does it track your carbon footprint, but it also can track your nitrogen footprint as well. So if we're concerned about nitrogen input into waterways or into soils, we can track that as a campus and figure out ways to mitigate that impact. If you're interested, you can go to the website here. I put it, and actually I was going to screen share what it looks like, but we'll wait to the end and I'll show you, if we have time, I can show you what it looks like from the user side and some of the data that they ask us to input. But it's basically that chart that we showed earlier of IUPUI's specific sources. There are a couple others that they have on there that may not be specific to us. But anyway, that's the tool that we use, and a lot of different colleges and universities use it. And this tool also helps us fulfill our STARS report. So universities, there's a tool called STARS, the Sustainability Tracking Assessment and Rating System, and we can upload information from SIMAP into STARS to report on our greenhouse gas reporting. SIMAP's definitely a much more detailed platform. It kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of carbon emissions, versus STARS just kind of wants your end number, but we have to do SIMAP in order to report to STARS, or you have to do some sort of accounting in order to report to STARS, whether you're using SIMAP or a different platform.
So again, this slide is based off a lot of the data that I gathered from the first project that I completed for the office, and then in addition to just simply looking up in Second Nature on their reporting platform, who's committed by 2020, and then on the right, those are the campuses that claim to be carbon neutral today. Jessica and I were talking about this yesterday. If we look down both these lists, I think it becomes fairly apparent rather quickly that the size of the school is a big indicator with how aggressive their targets are going to be set, as well as their eventual success in becoming carbon neutral. I included the full-time equivalents there on the carbon neutral universities on the right. American was the first to become carbon neutral, I believe. Isn't that correct, Jessica?
Yes.
And so they have just over 13,000 full-time equivalents, and then everyone else on that, except for University of San Francisco, is under 3. So it's very telling that it's a little bit easier when you're a smaller school and you don't have a lot of resources, a lot of missions to reduce or offset, that you can quickly kind of pivot. But that being said, if you go to the next slide, Jessica, don't lose hope. So these are some huge schools, and I didn't have full-time equivalents. I just have enrollment on there. And this is from a Rutgers report that came out in late January, early February, I believe. And they did a really good job of looking at climate action plans across the country. And so these are some of the bigger schools, definitely more well-known schools that have large student bodies and have done really good jobs reducing their emissions so far. Especially if you look at a place like, Minnesota, Maryland, 37% and 28% reductions in a decade. That's pretty impressive. And then Jessica, I don't know if you want to touch on IUPUI or IUs right now. That might be a good time.
Yeah, so as far as like enrollment, IUPUI, we're about 28,000 students, just to give you an idea of where we kind of fit in this framework. IU's a little bit bigger than us, but we're part of the IU system. But FTE in this case, on the previous slide, that's full-time equivalent. That's students and employees, right? So that's the whole size of the campus, 13,000 all in. Versus this is just student enrollment. So we have an additional about between 7,000 and 8,000 faculty and staff on our campus as well.
So these are the Indiana schools. Obviously, it's labeled there at the top. Second Nature only. Climate commitments only Ball State and Earlham. I believe we have Jamie on. Is Jamie on the call right now?
Yeah,
I think she is, but
yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Jamie.
Hey.
A little shout out for you.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Going down the list, obviously, some of these are a little bit smaller. Franklin, oops, I have Franklin on there twice, apparently. But Indiana State, that's considerable. Butler, in Indianapolis, very nationally visible school, has a carbon commitment. Ball State, obviously, it's a big school, and they have a climate commitment. So these are some of the leaders in the state right now that are doing a really good job of at least making commitments and working on their progress towards climate neutrality, or carbon neutrality, rather.
Yeah, and the dates of their commitments vary by school.
Yeah.
When we see commitments, the vast majority of them are somewhere in the 2040 to 2050 timeline scale. At least that's where, but most of them end up shaking out around around 2040, sometimes 2030 in that as far as a target date. So now I'm going to take on some of the successful strategies that other campuses that our own campus are employing. And just because I cover it doesn't matter. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing it here, but it is something that other places have done. Remember, when we went through those first steps, right, to assess your emissions, talk first about avoidance, then reduction, and then offsetting. So kind of think about that as we go through this process. You're going to see a lot of those words. I'm not going to get too far into the details, just going to hit the highlight reel of what some universities are doing. There are some pretty innovative things going on in this space, just because it's just constant evolution right now in this particular space and sustainability. So what I say today, there may be something brand new happening tomorrow. So the strategies that we're going to employ across all scopes, the way I'm going to cover these strategies are by scope. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And I'm going to pick out maybe 2 or 3 specific subcategories within those scopes, usually the biggest areas of impact, to talk about strategies. But across these scopes, avoidance and reduction are always going to be the 2 starting ones, and what that avoidance and reduction looks like varies by scope, but just know that you're going to see that a lot. So avoidance means just complete elimination, just so we're clear with verbiage here, and reduction means you're going to try to trim it back as much as you can, right? You may not be able to avoid it entirely, but we're at least going to try to do our due diligence to reduce it to the best of our ability. There's some things you're just not going to be able to get rid of. So one, in scope 1, so remember scope 1 is the things that you're directly responsible for. So at least at IUPUI, that's fleet fuel. If you had a power plant on campus, it would include your power plant in scope 1, but we don't. But for scope 1, a strategy you can employ is a fleet audit to actually ensure that your university-owned fleet is right-sized. You can imagine that as more vehicles are added to the fleet, that usually means more fuel is being used. So you can do internal fleet audits. Basically, the way that those fleet audits work is you're able to look at utilization rates for all of your campus vehicles and then decide if and when to replace vehicles once they age out of the system. Another thing that some campuses have started doing is moving to a leasing model over an ownership model. So instead of buying the vehicle outright, leasing it through some sort of third party, in that case, it actually moves the emissions from your fleet to scope 3 because the vehicle is no longer owned by the campus, it is owned by a third party. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, vehicle use in scope 3. But you could imagine like signing a contract with Enterprise or National or Hertz, and then that emissions now ends up on their scope 1 kind of calculation, but on our scope 3 calculation. Kind of the leasing model, it also saves, it can save on, just regular maintenance as well. Another big move is electrification. So we've been doing this here at IUPUI, is electrifying our fleet. So about 30% of our fleet is electrified or electric hybrid, something there. So that transitions your fuel source, right, from a traditional combustion fuel engine running on gasoline or diesel to electric. So that sets you up, even if your local utility isn't running on 100% renewable energy yet, it does set you up to be able to take advantage of that once that inevitable transition takes place. I don't think it's a question of if now, it's just a question of how quickly will that transition take place. Well, we've also moved to electrify like grounds equipment, like every place that fuel is used on a campus, which is a lot of different places outside of just vehicles running around, but service carts, generators. Generators are kind of the only exception to that because they're usually run on some sort of oil or fuel in case the grid goes down, right? So it's as a backup, but there can be creative energy storage mechanisms there that work. So that's a way to reduce your fleet fuel as a campus. Another one is stationary fuels. So again, this could be a power plant if you are a campus, or if you do have a power plant on your campus, or in our case, since we don't, our main stationary fuel is going to be like natural gas or some sort of distillate oil. So one thing you can do is you can fully electrify your buildings if you're running on natural gas. And we'll also touch on this in electricity as well. And again, that sets you up to be able to run, depending on your local market, to be able to run on renewable energy. One thing that's just a best practice across all utilities is having all of your buildings sub-metered. So oftentimes there's a main meter into the campus that's reading all your utility usage, whether it's from a utility provider or from your power plant, your owned power plant. But putting sub-meters on all of those buildings in order to be able to find inefficiencies quickly. You can imagine for a huge campus, if all you have is that 1 meter and you notice a spike in usage, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack to find where the high usage is coming from. Some campuses have gone so far as to sub-meter by floor of building, so you can refine even further. And some campuses have also gone so far as to sub-meter by room. Often that's in residence halls, so that information can be shared back with the students who live there. But the further you get in the refinement of the data, the quicker you're able to identify when something is going wrong and fix it quickly so that you are touching on the reduction piece of your utility usage. Occupancy sensors and building automation, I'll talk more about this in the electric one, but it works the same thing for natural gas, depending on if that's a heating source for you. And then set temperature ranges, again, I'll cover in the electric one. There's a lot of similarities between these two. So in electricity, there's been some pretty innovative solutions that campuses have put forward as far as like how to address emissions specifically from this source. One has been the creations of what have basically been called green revolving funds. And what a green revolving fund is, it's basically a bank account where the university makes oftentimes a one-time large initial deposit into that account, upwards of $1 million. It can depend on the size of the campus, but that's most of the time the dollar amount you see is around $1 million plus. So $1 million is allocated to projects, and projects that draw down on that account can only be spent on energy reduction efforts or energy efficiency efforts. And then what happens is once you spend money to renovate a building to make it more energy efficient, for the next, depends on how it's set up, but for the next year to 5 years, you might say, okay, here's the amount of money that we saved having paid for this project. We're going to recoup those savings for 1 to 5 years to put it back into that account. So for example, you think at home, like if your electric bill is normally $80 a month, but you were able to drop it to $50, for a year, you might take the $30 that you would have spent normally and put it into a savings account so that you could buy a new energy efficient appliance later. It's that same sort of philosophy, but just at the scale of a university. So it's recouping those savings to replenish that account to fund future investments in efficiency. There are quite a few campuses that have created green revolving funds like that. I mentioned also sub-meter buildings already. That's just a best practice across the board. Occupancy sensors and building automation. So occupancy sensors are a way to determine how full a building is in order to right size how you are maintaining that building's state as far as the environment, whether the condition state. So some occupancy sensors are based on movement, so movement of people. Others are based on like carbon dioxide. So as people fill up a room and start breathing, the carbon dioxide that we exhale is tracked by a sensor, and the sensor will determine how many people are in the room based on how much carbon dioxide is in the room, and will ventilate or heat and cool that room appropriately based on people who are in it. Occupancy sensors are a good way to save on electricity costs. Other than that, you may just be heating and cooling a building, assuming that it's being used to its full capacity at all times, and that's incorrect. Especially when we look in higher ed buildings, and this is likely true at your home as well. HVAC, heating and cooling, is the biggest electricity user, or natural gas user if you're also using natural gas. So anything we can do to curb the use of conditioned space is going to be a big savings. It's the biggest part of our electric bill is heating and cooling. And then also ventilation, so the movement of air so it doesn't get stale or doesn't feel sticky or humid. Set temperature ranges. So on our campus, we have a temperature range that buildings are allowed to float in at any given point. We also tend to not offer individual level thermostats. There are some exceptions of that, like so in people's individual office, they don't have access to a thermostat to be able to change the temperature of their own room. It's set at a building level. So the benefit of that is that by setting a range, you allow your building to float being not conditioned or not having to turn on your HVAC or any of your ventilation for a much longer time than if you were to just pick one temperature. So for example, I think our temperature range is 68 to 72. So in the summer, our buildings run a little bit warmer, and that is purposeful. In the winter, our buildings run a little bit cooler, and that is purposeful. But it also means that, you know, in the morning, especially in the summer, when buildings are starting to heat up, you might be able to take advantage of some of that, the building having cooled overnight, and it doesn't take so long for it to heat up to that 72 before it kicks on. So the temperature range offers a nice little buffer to not having to always correct back to one temperature point. Retro commissioning is a way of basically kind of hitting the restart button on how a building operates from a utilities standpoint or from a conditioning standpoint. So oftentimes retro commissioning programs, at least in an ideal setting, should happen about once a year for every building. And I'm talking like commercial scale buildings. where you'll go in, you will like verify that all the belts are working properly, that louvers are lubricated, that your systems that are run on code are coded properly, and you'll hit the reset button on that. As you use things throughout the course of the year, things just, they get a little bit sticky, all these things can happen. So in order to come in and hit the reset button, you can actually get more efficient utilization out of that same piece of equipment by doing that. And oftentimes retro commissioning or recommissioning is sometimes what they call it as well. It saves a lot of money. And even though it kind of appears expensive on the upfront, usually that retro commissioning pays for itself within a year, which is the goal, right? You want to get a return on investment before you have to do it again. Lighting upgrades are a big one as well. So after moving air and heating and cooling air, lighting is often the second biggest piece, or depends on if you have any sort of appliances in your building. But if you don't have those big appliances like coolers and refrigerators and medical equipment, then lighting can be like the second biggest portion of your energy profile for electricity. So lighting upgrades, moving to LED, these are kind of the obvious ones. Bi-level on sensors. So, as folks leave the classroom, you don't have to turn off lights. It just does it automatically because it notices if people are in there or not. Another thing you can do is what's called peak shaving. This is a little bit more from a cost perspective, but it also helps with your usage. So for big electricity users, a large portion of our electricity bill comes from the fact that we are demanding electricity when everybody else is, right? So you think when everybody gets up in the morning at the same time to go to work, there's a lot of stress on the grid to be able to provide all of that energy at the same time. So for campuses, if we're firing up at 8 a.m. in the morning, we're firing up when everybody else is. So if you can peak shave, or basically say, hey, we're going to try to delay our biggest fire up to either an earlier time or a later time, you can avoid those additional charges and those additional stressors on the grid. There have been some pretty creative ways to peak shave. You can often supplement with renewable. That can be a way to shave your peak. Another thing you can do is like change when classes are offered. Like don't have classes start at 8 a.m., have them start at maybe 9, or have them start at 7. The students don't like that one, of course, but you can change start time of classes. You can also change the start time of the workday. And some campuses have done that as well. Move the start time to 9 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. so that you're not putting stress on the grid at the same time everybody else is. Fuel switches. So this is oftentimes a switch to renewable, and we could have a whole presentation, you can teach a whole class on renewable energy, but basically there are like 3 options available, at least to entities of our size. You can do on-site installation, which means you would install your own solar on campus. So we have 164 panels on top of one of our buildings on campus. That's one example. You can purchase solar at like a commercial scale. That's often done through what's called a PPA, or a power purchase agreement. Here in Indiana, the virtual power purchase agreement is an option, which means that somebody else pays for the installation and installs it somewhere else, but then we lock in a low rate for a certain period of time. And then you can also just purchase RECs. So RECs are renewable energy certificates. You can often purchase those through a utility, the utility that provides to your campus, or through a third party. You can purchase RECs. There's a market for RECs, just like there's a market for carbon offsets. So RECs, from a sustainability professional standpoint, RECs are at the bottom of my list because it's just us spending money on something in order to be able to say we're doing it, which is great, right? It's better than doing nothing, but I would much rather see that money go towards actual steel in the ground installation of renewable energy. But we do purchase RECs at IUPUI because it's a very affordable option for us at this point. So our campus runs on 10% renewable energy by purchasing RECs plus our on-site generation. I already mentioned schedule alterations. Some campuses have taken this to the extreme. There have been a handful of campuses who have said, you know what, we're going to go to a 4-day work week so that we don't have to pay one day's, a Friday or a Monday's worth of full utility usage for our campus. And when they did the math, it just shook out that it was easier to extend the workday by 2 hours and just have people, work 4 10s than it was to add a whole nother day of heating and cooling capacity to all of the campus buildings. And at least for some campuses like ours, a lot of our students don't have class on Fridays anyway, because our class schedules tend to be front loaded Monday through Thursday. So that could be an attractive option to campuses that maybe already are kind of halfway there. And some campuses have, like I said, they've entirely moved to a 4-day work week and 4-day class week. And then also another extreme measure that some campuses have taken is a square footage cap, where they'll say, hey, you know, maybe our campus is 12 million square feet. At 15 million, we're done. We're not going to build any more buildings. We're going to have to go back to figure out how to reuse space we already have more efficiently. That's a pretty extreme measure to take, but some campuses have done it. And if you cap your square footage, that also typically means that you're capping your utility usage as well. Commuting.
Just before you go on,
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to touch on back to the PPA and VPPA. A lot of, well, at least a lot of companies, I'm not really sure yet about a lot of schools, but a lot of companies, when they start the sustainability process, they might buy those up front so they can kind of claim those credits right off the bat, and then kind of retroactively work back through the process of calculating their emissions again, and then actually taking, you know, steel in the ground, concrete steps to reduce those emissions. And then at the end, they can then, you know, cease purchasing so many credits. So that's a way that you can immediately kind of impact, I guess, your bottom line, for lack of a better word. But also, like Jessica said, it's definitely not the first, you know, shouldn't be your first and foremost strategy towards becoming carbon neutral. But I just wanted to say that.
Yep. So finally, to scope 3, I'm only going to touch on a couple categories here. Commuting being one near and dear to our heart here at IUPUI, and for a lot of urban campuses, commuting can be a struggle. So oftentimes this manifests itself as discouraging SOV, as single occupancy vehicle use on a campus, and then the flip side of that is in supporting alternative transportation. So this can look at things like offering carpool parking passes at discounted rates, free bus passes. Some campuses like Purdue have instituted a 1 mile radius rule for the campus, where if you live within 1 mile radius of campus, you cannot buy a parking permit. You have to figure out how to get to campus via a different mechanism. So there are ways that we can encourage and discourage folks to get around ways that we want them to, but we also have to be sensitive to the fact that this is going to be a category where no matter our best efforts, we're always going to have some people who are driving. So that means that we're likely going to have to do some sort of offsetting for that, or look at different creative solutions, maybe not purchasing offsets, but investing in technology or carbon sequestration efforts, you know, to handle that. You can also improve your campus design to encourage people not to drive or to get around via mechanisms that are different. So if parking is a little bit of a hassle, you might encourage people to get to campus in a different way. On-campus housing obviously supports folks living on campus and not commuting. The flip side of that is that now you're stuck with the emissions from that building once it's on your grid. Real-time parking information can be a way to speed up the parking experience. So, you know, digital displays that tell you how many spots are available on each floor of a parking garage or in each lot, so that people don't spend 20, 30 minutes driving around campus looking for a spot and wasting all of that fuel and all the associated emissions. They can just find where they need to go as quickly as possible. Another thing is work and class schedule alterations. Just like with electricity, you can do the same thing to support commuting. If you have the majority of your folks commuting during rush hour, there's going to be more emissions associated with that than if they were to start at an earlier or a later time. And then also, as we're finding out with COVID-19, remote work and online classes, right? We can eliminate commuting in some cases, right? So that's an elimination strategy, or it can also be a reduction strategy too. Travel, so this is university supported travel. So like if faculty go to conferences or students go to conferences and it's funded by the university, they would fit into our scope 3 profile. There's some kind of emerging trends here, and there's a lot of flux in this particular category of scope 3 just because of what different companies are doing. But you could set up that your university has a preferred vendor and only flies with certain airlines, or at least prioritizes the flight with certain airlines. So for example, JetBlue and Delta earlier this year announced that they're going to automatically offset all of the emissions for their passengers. So as a university, we could say, hey, JetBlue and Delta are our recommended providers, and we would encourage you to use them first, because if Delta and JetBlue are already offsetting those emissions, that means that we don't have to as a campus because they're already taken care of. Otherwise, it would be a double offset. You can put limits on flights to destinations within a certain radius of campus. So oftentimes the 5-hour mark is considered to be like reasonable, because by the time you get to the airport early, park, get through security, get on the plane, it will likely end up, if you consider, flying to Chicago versus driving is going to be actually quicker as far as a time when you consider the full amount of time you're going to have to spend getting ready for that flight. So you could put a radius on, say, hey, listen, we're only going to support flights if they're at least 5 hours away from campus, right? If it's a destination within 5 hours, so St. Louis might be a 5-hour destination, you're going to have to drive there because the emissions there would be less, or take a bus or a Greyhound or something, but not fly. What other campuses have done as well is assess a carbon fee on all travel. So it's an internal carbon fee. So the simplest version of this is that every university supported trip, I've seen a handful of campuses do this, are assessed a $5 fee that is tacked on to every university supported travel. And that $5 fee goes into a separate account, and then that $5 fee is used, when multiplied by thousands of people, is used to buy offsets for any of the remaining emissions that aren't already accounted for in the travel portion of scope 3. And that allows you to then to purchase offsets, which is the last one. You could just flat out purchase them outright as a campus, or you could assess that fee onto the user. Food is also a big component of scope 3 emissions, what kind of food you buy and where it comes from. This is one we haven't taken a really deep dive into at IUPUI yet. Hopefully we can here over the next year. We think we can get some data access that allows us to answer this question. But basically, we should be prioritizing the procurement of local food. Some campuses have put local food, or what we call real food, in higher ed, which means local, organic, or some sort of third-party verified food that is considered real food. We might set a goal as a campus. So Bloomington has a goal of 25% real food by 2025. So you can imagine if you're purchasing your food locally, which in our world means grown within 250 miles of campus, if you can increase that to the best of your ability, you're decreasing the carbon footprint for that food. And you can then take the benefits of that. You can grow your own food on campus, which a lot of campuses do. We do that here at IUPUI. Rescue food waste, both for reuse, but also for compost, which we'll talk about on the next slide, which is waste. A compost is actually considered a carbon sequestration strategy. And then also you can purchase offsets if you're not able to address your food emissions entirely. There are just some things that, you're never gonna be able to buy a pineapple that's grown locally, right? That's just how it is. So unless you're gonna stop serving pineapple, they're just gonna be shipped in from somewhere else. Waste is one of the last big categories. As far as like our waste profile as a campus, at least here in Indianapolis, the majority of our trash goes to an incinerator and not a landfill. We do have a landfill, but it's kind of reserved for different types of more construction waste or biohazard waste. So the biggest thing you can do is actually change your procurement. Waste in is waste out. So what you buy really matters, which means as a campus, are you buying things? Are you buying products that are going to be have more recycled content in them, or be recyclable, so that product won't end up in an incinerator? Also from a procurement standpoint, this is where reduction or elimination is really, really helpful. Just asking the question, like, do we really need that? And sometimes the answer a lot of times is no. Product bans and switches have occurred on some campuses. So some campuses have straight out banned single-use plastics because the majority of those, like cutlery, straws, plastic bags, can't be recycled anyway, or switch to a compostable or recyclable version of that. Capture as many waste streams as you can for reuse. So even the kind of more weird ones, like cooking oil from your big kitchen, or wood pallets where things get delivered to you on campus, or your landscaping waste for compost, thinking like beyond the bin and more at other sources of waste on your campus and how they may eventually be disposed of. As I mentioned before, compost is actually considered a carbon sequestration strategy. So it's a way that you can offset your own emissions from waste. So collecting food waste and landscaping waste and sending that to compost instead of to a landfill. And that way that material can hopefully then be reused on your campus as well in your landscaping or in your gardens. And then again, for waste, there may be some left over where you will have to purchase some offsets there as well, or invest in some sort of technology. So when we think about how we prioritize these solutions across all of the scopes, this is kind of like this isn't necessarily, this is just like from my head, so don't think this is just like a guide that exists somewhere, but from the sustainability professional, when I think about ranking them, this is how I rank them. As in, we're gonna avoid first, reduce second, we'll do if whatever we can reduce, whatever we can reduce to, we're gonna try to switch to a more responsible version of that. And then we're going to make campus investments in research or technology around carbon sinks. So whether that's planting trees on campus, composting more, developing carbon sequestration technology for campus. And then the last one is purchasing carbon offsets. Kind of just like RECs, renewable energy certificates. They're not my preferred method. They're kind of a little bit of an easy way out, but we also know that at the end of the day, we're still gonna have some stuff that's left over if we can't invest in enough technology. So we try to mitigate, greatly reduce the amount of carbon offsets that you have to buy, because if you're buying carbon offsets, all that is just campus money that is being spent, and you're really not getting anything in return except for being able to make the claim that you're neutral. So it's not always the best use of funding when you could be investing, especially for a campus, in R&D instead. Same thing with RECs. We could invest in R&D in renewable, and I would prefer that over purchasing RECs. So there's always a question about what are carbon offsets. This could be a whole other thing that we could talk about too, but it's a third-party market. It's a verified system. It's a way of accounting for carbon, where basically a certain organization could invest in some sort of project that's going to sequester carbon. So you might, like a simple example might be like a reforestation project. And you can basically buy the carbon that reforestation project would sequester and count that on our accounting sheets. It's a lot more detailed than that, but there's the carbon offsets have to be verified. They will then go onto some sort of platform. The transaction is verified, and then that accounting lives with the institution that purchases it. The nice thing is that the organization who's working on that carbon sequestration project would get at least a portion of the sums that are used to buy those offsets. There's usually some middleman fees that are paid as well for the organization that's kind of like helping with that transaction. You want to go, David?
Yeah, so now that we've talked a little bit about, the state of upper education and where they are in Indiana, especially in terms of carbon neutrality, and then we talked about the strategies, how to get there, and at least some of the ones that we've been using, some of the ones we haven't been using here at IUPUI. I wanted to give a quick update, again, nothing too much in the details, but on the newest campus to announce carbon neutrality, just in January, it's Colorado College. So first I'm going to talk about a little bit about the timeline. And again, this is going to be brief. This is not, it says case study on there, but it's not really going to be a case study. So I'm going to go timeline and then talk about the strategies that they used, and then some of the advantages that Colorado College might have over some of the other bigger universities that are trying to tackle these goals. So in 2003, you can see right in front of you, they formed the working group of on-campus sustainability that was comprised of faculty, staff members, students, and that was mandated by the president of the university in 2003. Soon thereafter, the Campus Sustainability Council, again, that was an outcome of the working group on campus sustainability. So they decided that they needed a permanent Campus Sustainability Council. In 2004. In 2008, they hired a consulting firm to take a look at their carbon emissions and take a look at the issue of carbon neutrality at Colorado College. And the result of that is the Brendel report, which kind of laid out not necessarily a step-by-step, but certainly a pathway to get to carbon neutrality. And then just right after that, in 2009, President Celeste, I believe, committed to second nature for carbon neutrality by 2020. And then between 2010, 2019, they took all their action steps to get to that goal. And they announced that they are carbon neutral in January. So it was a very quick turnaround. They didn't commit to actually becoming carbon neutral until 2009, and to see them, 10, 11 years later, carbon neutral is pretty astounding, and I think that's can serve as a bit of inspiration for the rest of us. So looking at the biggest strategies that Colorado College did, first one is efficiency upgrades across the board, and then kind of the same thing, kind of not. I talked with Jessica about this, building renovations. Efficiency upgrades kind of covers everything, whereas building renovations is more in tune with the envelope of the building itself. So more along the lines of, insulation upgrades to, keep the heat trapped in or keep the cool trapped in the summer, things like that. Campus engagement is huge, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And that was another one of their major strategies that they were able to employ to get to their goal. On-site renewable energy. I believe they built a couple different spots for solar power, and then finally local renewable energy purchases around Colorado that they were able to put into their resource mix to become carbon neutral. All right, we got 5 minutes. So the advantages that Colorado College has, first of all, probably one of the most important things, and I think Jessica might talk about this in a little bit, is they had very, very strong leadership from the top. First, the President Celeste, and then I'm going to butcher this name. I apologize ahead of time. To Finfiller. They're both very strong supporters of environmental sustainability. They wanted their students and their staff and faculty to be engaged in the process of becoming carbon neutral, and they both had they both encouraged that through the campus sustainability council and multiple working groups during that period from 2004 to 2009, before the commitment was actually made public. The second thing is they have a super engaged student body, and I included this picture on the right to kind of give you an idea of where they are. And I don't know about you guys, but that view would definitely be a little bit motivating for me to have the mountains in the background and kind of have that in the forefront of my mind the whole time. So again, they have a small student body, but they're super, super engaged. And they have a really active sustainability office right now. They had a new director come in, I believe, around 2015. Ian Johnson, I believe, is his name. And obviously, they've done an incredible job getting to carbon neutrality where they are in such a short amount of time. So that's just the newest campus to announce it. So I wanted to highlight that quickly before we move on to challenges. And Jessica, take it away.
Sure. So I'll try to do this in like 2 minutes. So we have time for questions here. And we can go beyond. If people want to jump off, that's totally fine, or you can stay and we can talk. So some challenges. So I would say don't interpret this as like, oh, this is the reason why we can't do it, but I just want people to be aware of like the landscape of campuses when we're making decisions like this. First of all, every sustainability decision that a campus makes is customized to that campus. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for sustainability fixes, which means that if something is tailored, it just takes a lot longer. One thing is that scale and size matters. So you notice the campuses that already are carbon neutral, a lot of them are smaller campuses. What does that mean? Well, it means you're already starting with a smaller footprint, and small universities are nimble, they're quick. You can engage 2,300 students when there's only 2,300 of them. It's a lot harder when you've got 23,000 of them to mobilize all of them. Oftentimes, let's go to the next one. Balancing mission with neutrality. So there's always going to be, depending on how you frame it, and if you were to frame it correctly, it wouldn't be an issue, but there can be an issue where a mission of an academic, of a higher institution of higher education is academics and research. And if neutrality is perceived as distracting from that mission, it can be a problem. So it is meaning like, is somebody high up going to say, well, this is a project that distracts from what we're really here for? Like, why does it matter that we're carbon neutral? That has no bearing on our academic or our research offerings. Well, a smart sustainability professional would be able to make the connection between neutrality and academic and research opportunities. But just to know that that's going to be something that will likely be in the mind of some folks who maybe aren't like President Celeste at Colorado College, where they already started as champions. Cost is always an issue, especially when we start looking at things like purchasing offsets, because maybe at the end of the day, we're not going to get a lot out of that besides just being able to say on the accounting end that we're getting the job done. At least on some of the upfront projects like the avoidance and reduction, there are going to be significant cost savings there. So the savings might be able to balance the costs out in the end, but until you really know how many emissions are left over that we have to offset, it's hard to be able to nail down a specific price on that. And then what is that cost taking away from? And was it taking away from student experiences or student learning? Perception is reality. I think this is true across the board for what we all do. How is somebody going to perceive this? As great as we might think it might be, there are just as many people on the opposite side perceiving it as something that's not great. And what are some of those external pressures to your campus that you may not be aware of or may not be sensitive to? And like, how do you frame your message to deal with that is really important. Another thing is that the market is rapidly changing. It seems like every day there's something new coming out, some new technology, some new strategy that Delta is going to offset all of their emissions. Right? Companies are making declarations like this. So as the market changes, that means our target changes and the cost of hitting that target changes. So it's hard to go into the room and say, if somebody who's in charge of your finances says, how much is this going to cost? To be able to go in and say, it's going to cost X, because it's not going to cost X. That's just what it costs today. 5 days from now, it might cost Y. So just because there's a lot of movement, it's just a lot of moving pieces to keep track of. And then also, as a medical campus, we can kind of speak to this one specifically. Medical campuses are a different beast as far as their energy profile. We are really big energy hogs, and that is because we have hospitals on our campus that are running 24/7. We have really energy intensive equipment. We're doing research on pathogens and biological, like all these things that need to be, contained, and that requires energy to do that. So there, you might see a little bit of a stress sometimes between, especially if you're a medical campus, being able to still do your work in the medical field, but then also balancing that with neutrality. Not speaking from experience from that, I'm just saying that you could see that happening. So with that, I think we left like 1 minute, but we'll stay longer than that to open it up for questions from the group. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and we'll go back to a gallery view. For folks who have questions, you can drop them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself, kind of take yourself off. If you want to show your beautiful face, you can do that too, or you can just talk with your voice. We'll kind of field them that way. So we'll open it up, whoever wants to start. Or if people just want to go to lunch, that's fine too.
I would be curious actually myself, and I don't know if you want to talk, Jamie, but not to put you on the spot or anything, just, going through this process with IUPUI and IU, if, Earlham has any specific strategies that you didn't necessarily see on the presentation today. I would love to be enlightened, but no pressure. You don't have to say anything.
Thanks, no pressure. Well, I'll actually put a little caveat in here that we just signed on to those climate commitments last fall. So we're real new to that piece of it. I mean, obviously we've been doing sustainability work for a while, and we've been, doing STARS reporting for a while, but yeah, we're just now kind of getting going on some of the assessments and starting to think about developing an actual climate action plan and what that's going to look like, which is mainly why I'm sitting in on this, is because we're kind of soaking all this in right now to figure out what our path is going to be. So yeah, so unfortunately I don't have a lot of insight to add, but this was very helpful.
That's good. Yeah. That's good to hear. What date did you all decide to commit by?
We actually haven't set that yet.
Okay, so that'll be part of your planning process.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Well, yeah. Cool. Like, you crossed the first hurdle of getting somebody to say, let's do it.
Yeah, this is true.
Any other questions from folks or comments?
I had something I'd like to share.
Sure.
This is Daniel. I might as well turn on my video. I have okay bandwidth. First of all, this was awesome. It was incredibly dense in a good way. It showed thousands of hours of study, like distilled. It was really high quality from my perspective. The two quick things. The one is there's all sorts of cool solutions when you're looking for solutions. I've been researching a turf grass that sequesters 7 times the carbon that regular grass does, and it gets you LEED points. I'm working with a few campuses here in Indiana to implement the grass. So there's all sorts of solutions everywhere. The second one is more of like a strategy or thing. We're in this mess because we're externalizing costs, right? We're not internalizing the costs. That's why we're in this mess. So I've only recently discovered this idea of the social cost of carbon. And I think it's a game changer. It basically describes, like, imagine somebody who wants to quit swearing. They want to quit a bad habit. They could promise that they'll reduce, or they could put $5 in a box every time they swear. Which do you think will have a bigger impact on their behavior?
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't looked at the social cost of carbon, it ranges from $37 a ton up to $400 a ton. And I looked at Purdue and IU. If Purdue and IU go carbon neutral by 2050, they will externalize between $600 million to $7 billion in costs to the most vulnerable if they wait to 2050. If they do it by 2025, they won't damage the vulnerable as much. They'll have about $500 million to $6 billion less in damages. So I just wanted to throw the social cost of carbon out there as like a way to completely change the frame.
Yeah, and we speak about that especially as a medical campus in light of like what's the social cost of health implications. That's an easy in for that conversation because we have programs and we're training future physicians and future public health officials. That's been a really great lens through which to, because not everyone, unless it ends up on the books and you're paying it, not everyone cares about external costs, right? But that's a way to make it very real from an academic standpoint, is to look at across your programming and speak about how is this going to impact the professionals that you're training for the future. So that's a way to take that conversation and bring it a bit closer to home, especially on an academic campus. But yeah, the $5 rule definitely works. I think it might be Yale. I think it's Yale. It's one of the Ivy Leagues that they actually created their own on-campus carbon market. So schools that are more carbon intensive have to pay for their carbon, and schools that are less carbon intensive get a financial benefit to that. And that has been and that was actually an idea developed by students, and that has been quite effective at driving down their greenhouse gas emissions, actually using a free market solution on a campus. So. Any other questions or thoughts? Awesome. Well, thanks to you all for coming. We really appreciate your time. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is recorded. We'll get this edited and uploaded into YouTube, hopefully sometime today. And then we'll follow up. Maybe we can, like that records report, David, we could send them that, and like some of the resources that we've put together on neutrality.
I was thinking about including that, the VPPA report from EDF on Cummins, because that is a really
local company.
Look at too.
So we'll send you some resources, and like I said, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer questions around this. And I guess we'll leave it there with you all, and we'll see you virtually. Hopefully you'll join us for more of our future webinars. So yeah, and thanks for sharing that social cost resource, Daniel. So have a great day, everyone. We'll see you on the interwebs later.
Yes.